So I saw Wicked. All right, welcome to an interior analysis solo episode thing. I don't know if I'm gonna keep doing these, but I saw Wicked, so I decided to do a little bit of a follow up because I talked about it in the Gritty Fairy Tales ranking video, and from there I got really curious about it, and I started reading the audiobook, or not reading the audiobook. I started listening to the audiobook. I'm not done with it. I think a bit more than halfway through. And then last weekend when I was at my parents' for Thanksgiving, I saw Wicked Part 1. So I decided to just do a quick review on it. So to get us a little bit of runway for those of you who watched the Gritty Fairy Tales ranking bit, no, this is not a revitalization of the Gritty Fairy Tale genre, as I expected it would be. Sorry, that's to say, I expected that it would be pretty much what it was, that it would not revitalize that genre. However, in listening to the audiobook, I think a faithful adaptation of the book rather than the musical is almost exactly what I was pitching at the end of the Gritty Fairy Tales essay, with like using fairy tale settings to explore like marginalized identities, and it actually does go pretty hard on some like grittier elements. There's lots of systemic oppression, and it's definitely made for adults. It's not campy at all. It is pretty serious in tone in ways that the musical absolutely is not. So I'm not done with the book, so I'm not going to comment on it too much. And the movie's what we're all here to really hear about, I think. So, in seeing the movie, for background, I had never seen the play, but I have younger sisters, and for that reason, I have heard many, I don't know about most, of the songs in the musical because they would listen to the soundtrack a lot when we were younger. And as it turned out, I actually had heard all of the songs that were in this first part, I think. I'm not remembering any that sounded unfamiliar. So it turned out I had a decent amount of runway, or a decent amount of prior knowledge at least. To start off, I guess, my rating for this is 3 out of 5 or 6 out of 10, whichever you prefer of those. I was not necessarily expecting to enjoy it. I was going more out of curiosity than anything else. It surprised me in some ways and didn't in others. I'm going to get into spoilers, by the way, also. So if you haven't seen it, um, probably just fair warning. Some general things first. I thought this had some fairly predictable movie musical adaptation problems. I always am like just hesitant when I see Hollywood adapting a musical because there are things that just work on stage that don't work as well in movies, because you're kind of having this conflict of like narrative language, if I can call it that. In a musical, in a play, you can have 40 extras dancing in the background, and that's your big like spectacle impactful moment, and that's fine on stage. When you point a camera at that and bring camera movements and editing into it, there are like clashes that start happening there, and I felt that in Wicked. Just take the concept of a close-up is a very powerful tool in a filmmaker's toolbox. Like, that is when you were trying to get into the emotion of a character. Now, musicals don't have that when they are on stage. You have the audience looking at, from the same angle, the same perspective the whole time. And everyone's looking at it from a different angle because they're all sitting in a different part of the theater. So you have to use different techniques to kind of give the same effect as a close-up would have. You might isolate a character with a spotlight, or just have them be alone on stage. Like, that's sort of, I think, the closest you could do to, like, forcing your audience to look at one person and focus on them. I was paying a lot of attention to close-ups in Wicked because I was curious to see, like, are they going to pretty much just do the musical straight ahead, or are they going to try to, like, use film language to add another layer to it? And for my money, I did not notice them doing any of that to speak of. I had a conversation with my roommate after I came back home after Thanksgiving, and she thought that there was a lot of subtext in there, which I did not see. I'm not going to go into all of it because I don't want to speak too much for her or misrepresent her points. But I will stand by that, despite the subtext that she pointed out to me that I hadn't noticed, I don't think that the cinematic language that was used necessarily helped to bring that forward. I think it may have been harmful even in some cases. Like, the close-ups, that was what I was looking for. And I feel like they didn't detract, but they certainly weren't used in the ways that, like, close-ups often are. And I found a very curious thing that happened in how editing was used in some of the larger sequences. Like, when you have some songs that are montages, like you have I think it's What Is This Feeling? The end of that song kind of turns into a montage, and then I'm not thinking of the name of the song right now, but when they get to Oz, when they get to the Emerald City, that song that they do then ends up being a montage for a lot of it. And there's this really curious thing that happens in those sequences where they're flashing to these sets where there's a lot of actors and the sets are very clearly built out, and there's some very well choreographed extras doing a lot of dances, or at least like some kind of choreography. But they're only cutting to them for, maybe 2 seconds at a time, or they're doing it very quickly. So there's obviously a lot of money and effort on the production stage being put into these bits that are only being used for about 4 seconds total in the final sequence. And even before post-production, like, I was noticing that as like an editing choice, but there's also production things that are happening as well, where the camera is like moving in fairly close proximity to the actors past like a whole line of extras who are, again, doing like a really well choreographed dance on this built out set. And I don't quite know how to feel about it. It almost feels like wasteful in some way. And it again is going back to that like conflict between theater and film as mediums. Like, you have tons of extras doing these dances, and you're not even showing all of them, which is okay in other cases. Like, if you have like a movie where there's a crowd of people, fill in the context as you want. Maybe it's a disaster movie, maybe there's a performance happening. You're not having those extras really do anything. They're just there to represent a crowd. These extras are not quite in that same category because they're doing very skilled work that is an integral part of the texture of this movie and part of the storytelling. And you're kind of like spotlighting them strangely when you bring like camera movements and editing into a big choreographed sequence, and especially a montage one. I thought it worked a lot cleaner in the sequences like Dancing Through Life, where you have extras like doing flips and dance moves around this set and you're staying there for a long time. It felt like theater. It felt like, okay, we have this set that we're going to stay in for maybe 10 minutes, and then at the end of the scene, the set will change, but while we're here, we're going to have all these extras dancing. Like, that felt a lot more theatrical, whereas some of the montage ones had, like, again, just like a clash of narrative languages, clashing mediums that were coming into play. So that was something I noticed a lot. On a story level, I took a little issue. I guess I'm getting my negatives out of the way here first. I do have positives that I'll get to later. The main problem that I had from a story sense was that I felt like there was a lack of setups and payoffs. Or it felt like there were payoffs without setups in a lot of cases. I especially felt this with Elphaba's, like, the progression of her powers throughout the movie. Like, in the climax, we get introduced to the concept of the Grimmery. I think it's the name of the thing. The book that the wizard has that only, like, real magic users can use. And at that point, we've seen Elphaba, like, use her telekinesis in very sporadic ways that are obviously fueled by emotion, but they're a little unfocused. That's a fairly common thing you can see with like fantasy powered characters. It's a little bit of a trope, but I actually happen to like that trope a lot. And then we have one sequence where Madame Morrible is trying to like help her focus that skill and teaching her technique with it a little bit. And it's not very long. It mostly consists of Madame Morrible using like a recent, I think there's like some incident that happens with Dr. Dillamond, and she brings that up to create an emotional reaction from Elphaba. But again, it's very unfocused and we don't see her like struggle to control it in that scene. Then we leave it until we get to Oz, and she's able to read the Grimmery with no like prior knowledge of the language that's being written in that book. That's a thing from a character perspective, and I don't even mind that she's able to do that off the bat. But we just like left the plot thread of her powers alone for so long and hadn't progressed it enough that like I wasn't even really sure what that moment meant for her. Bringing up the Grimmery that late felt like it was too late to introduce that concept. That might be a symptom of this being a part one. Maybe that book is not mentioned until that point in the play, which I can understand. But if you're going to adapt it, give us like something to just introduce the concept of what is the Grimmery, what is the role of like true magic users in this world a little bit more. So that way, when everyone's shocked that Elphaba can use the Grimmery and like read that book without knowing the language, it has a little bit of a stronger impact. Because as it stands in the movie currently, that concept is introduced to us maybe 2 minutes before the payoff happens, which to me is not effective setup and payoff. So then to like close that thread out, we have Defying Gravity, which I'll get to how much I like that scene in a minute, but I was a little bit let down by it because of the lack of build-up that we had of Elphaba's powers. I was thinking about, I hope people don't mind this comparison, but I was thinking about Magneto in X-Men First Class, where he has a kind of a similar arc to Elphaba's in terms of like use of their powers, at least. He's only able to use his power through anger, and then we get a couple of scenes that show him and Charles like working to help him channel it when he's not just in a stressful situation or when he's pissed off. So I kind of wanted another scene like that with Elphaba, so that way when she is able to fly at the end and is channeling her like telekinesis fully, I wanted there to be like some kind of character texture to that, where we knew that like this shows that she's, mastered some or come to some like end of an arc. In X-Men First Class, Magneto kind of like takes a sort of a tragic fall, but we have a beat where we can see that he is capable of channeling his powers through emotions that are not just rage. I wish we had seen more of that with Elphaba, because as it stands, it feels like she's just kind of using her powers sporadically and has no control over them, and then all of a sudden she does at the end. I found that to be a little bit of a letdown, because I think that moment could have been more powerful if we had had just one more scene maybe to build it up. That said, Defying Gravity is among my favorite scenes this year. Obviously, it's the big song from this play as a whole. I don't even think I know any songs from part 2. It seems like all of the ones that people know are in this, like Popular and Defying Gravity and Dancing Through Life. I went into, when I saw that, okay, we're at Defying Gravity, I was like, okay, I really hope they nail this and get some like really strong imagery to go along with the song. Because the song is, I'm not a huge musical person, but the song is a banger. And I was really hoping that, like, in this adaptation, they could do it justice. And despite what I was saying a little bit ago about, like, the lack of power scaling context that we have in that scene, I do think, in isolation, that scene rips. Like, we got some really strong imagery, and I was so happy that they ended the movie there. Like, that gave me a lot of grace walking out of the theater, like, as Elphaba is flying away from Oz with the monkeys trailing her and like the music swelling. I was like, end here, end here, end here. Hell yeah. And like it cuts to black and says like to be continued. No notes. Perfect way to end the movie. I think everyone probably got chills at that scene. I've seen a little bit of criticism of it. Somebody I think was saying like the CGI is bad in that scene. I don't really care. I didn't like, sure, there's a lot of CGI in there. How else are you gonna film that scene though? I was happy with that as the ending. Where do I want to go next? I don't really have a good segue. Okay, I'll get my last negative out of the way. I probably should have done this before praising that scene, but I do want to talk about what I thought was one of the worst scenes of this year. And thankfully it didn't break the movie for me. But when they are at the Ozdust ballroom and Elphaba is like cringe dancing in front of everyone and then Glinda joins her, it so did not work for me. And I asked my mom and one of my sisters afterward, because they had seen the musical performed many years ago. I was like, is that in the musical? Because I could kind of excuse it if it is. It sounds like, according to them, it is not. I get what the scene is trying to do. It's like showing them connecting, and Glinda is like putting herself in a vulnerable social position to like kind of repay Elphaba's kindness. The scene is still really long and really cringe, and it just so did not work for me. Like, the only scene that I think is worse from this year is when they showed the Fox logo in the void in Deadpool and Wolverine. Like, it was almost that bad. You can listen to more of my thoughts on that in the Deadpool and Wolverine episode, but oh, that was a rough scene. There was one that this has nothing to do with the actual movie, but there was a funny moment in my theater with that. I'm going to try to find the image of this if I can. but there's a part where like I'm gonna try to show this with my hands. Elphaba and Glinda like put their hands out from like their stomachs like this, and they touch hands. And there was this little kid in the row behind us that was like, "Oh my god, they're having babies," which I thought was hilarious. Aside from that, I really hated that scene. To springboard off of that, because there was a lot of another thing that's like, it was a small annoyance that I had. There was a lot of like whispering in this movie. Like, I felt like they thought whispering was a lot funnier than, for my money, it is ever. That whole scene had like background extras whispering a lot, and there were several scenes of that. Like, there were a lot of scenes where it felt like they had a bunch of extras in the background that really didn't need to be there. I especially felt this with, and this can transition us into maybe the last topic, which is talk about the actors. I love Bowen Yang. I don't quite understand, like, what they wrote his character to be. Because he's not bad here, but it felt like every line that him and, I'm looking at the cast, the character's name is Shenshen, and I hope I say this name right, Bronwyn James? I apologize if I said that wrong. But they're sort of Galinda's two sidekicks. And I felt like every line that they said, it didn't feel scripted. It felt like they just told, I don't know the other actor, so maybe she's got a history of this too, but it felt like they told Bowen Yang to just show up to a bunch of scenes and improv any line that he thought would be funny to throw in. But he like whispers all of them. Like, none of his lines are like fully audible, which I thought was really weird. He's still very charismatic and great, but it felt very strange that like it seemed like they just said, all right, make a note here. We're going to have Bowen Yang here. This might be a good spot to insert one of his lines, but they didn't write any out for him. I might be wrong about that. That's just kind of how it came off. That said, I was pretty happy with the cast of this movie and how they performed. I'm not somebody who's good at critiquing like musical performances, so I'm not going to. Cynthia Erivo, I really hope she takes off, because she's been in stuff for a few years now and just hasn't really found the right project to spotlight her. Like, she's in Widowed, she was in Bad Times at the El Royale, which is like Knives Out but worse. She was in that Harriet Tubman movie, but she hasn't really found like her breakout thing, and it seems like this is it. So I think this should launch her career. I really hope it does, because I think we could see an Oscar caliber performance out of her given the correct role someday. Ariana Grande, also pretty solid. I'm not especially a fan of her music. I didn't grow up watching Victorious or any other Nickelodeon shows for that matter, but I thought she played Glinda very well. I was not expecting her hair to be the thing that made me laugh the most in this movie. The hair toss that she does a few times is surprisingly funny. Other actors, Michelle Yeoh, always happy to see her here. I saw somebody say that they thought she gave a phoned-in performance. I'm going to disagree. You know, it's no Everything Everywhere, of course, because what could be? But I thought it was a good Michelle Yeoh performance. Peter Dinklage, sure. I don't know if you needed him in that role. I was kind of surprised to hear his voice. Bowen Yang, again, despite how they like incorporated his character, I thought he was good. I will say the only downside for the actors, I did not enjoy Jeff Goldblum as the wizard. I don't dislike him as an actor most of the time, but it felt like they really turned up the volume on, like, we're gonna have Jeff Goldblum be Jeff Goldblum, and oh wow, I guess it could be yellow, and like the whole bit with him just being aggressively, like really aggressively, Jeff Goldblum is gonna Jeff Goldblum the crap out of this role. Like, I thought there was a little too much of that. Thankfully, he's not in the movie very much, but it was a bit of a weak point. To end this off, I'll probably see. That's pretty much the extent of my review. I will probably end up seeing the sequel, part two. I would rewatch this, if only to pick up on some subtext that I think I missed. I will say, just like, because I sort of did this in context of like the trend videos that I've been making, I think this is good for the industry on the whole, or it's at least not a negative. I am happy that it is getting good reception and financial success. I think it's about time that, like, but I hope this doesn't sound cynical, but between this and Barbie, the past 2 years have given us some very, like, movies that have been heavily marketed toward women. And in this case, theater kids especially, that have been very successful and been given big budgets. I am happy that that is a thing. Men have gotten a lot of stuff that is made for them and given huge budgets, like the entire superhero trend. I know, like, that has broad appeal and people of all gender identities enjoy them, but their target audience initially was like 14-year-old boys. And I'm happy that we're at least starting to get stuff that costs $150 million and makes close to $1 billion, if not more, that is now targeting 14-year-old girls. I hope that is something that continues going forward. We're probably going to get stuff that's not as good. I thought there were some things here that, like, were a little disappointing, just in terms of, like, wow, there's no subtext in this movie, or at least I didn't think there was very much of it. My roommate made some good points. I hope that lessons are learned from this in terms of, like, let's make high budget things for largely female audiences, or at least, like, primarily female audiences. I hope that continues going forward. I also am a little worried that because this has a lot of the bumps of musical to movie adaptations, that we're gonna keep getting stuff that exhibits those same problems. John M. Chu, I think, did a good job directing this. Like, I think he made sense as a choice between Crazy Rich Asians and In the Heights. Like, he's proven he's got the sauce to do this. I do think he still fell prey to some, like I was talking about before, like all of the issues that come up with musical to movie adaptations, and I don't really fault him for that. Like, I don't think it's necessarily his fault, and I don't think he does an especially bad job compared to, like, other movie musical adaptations. I still worry that we're gonna get stuff, like, just on a fundamental level. I think there's some stuff that just does not work in different mediums. It goes both ways. Like, I haven't seen many of the musical adaptations of movies, but I suspect that a lot of them suffer from, like, the reverse treatment, where there's some stuff that's done in film language that you just can't really replicate on screen or on stage. I worry that we're going to get the same thing. I mean, we've already seen it, and we have examples. Cats is a massive one. We all kind of saw very early with that how much making a live action version of Cats is not a thing that should ever be done. So I hope that when people are, like, making stuff to follow Wicked, at least in terms of, like, adapting musicals, they keep the Cats movie in the back of their head. Because there's just some stuff that doesn't work across mediums. So I hope that there's a balance that is incorporated there. Yeah, I'm trying to think if I have anything else there. I don't know if I'm going to do more single reviews like this. I kind of only did it because it was a thing that I brought up at the end of the fairy tales ranking video, and I just sort of wanted to follow up on it. So maybe if there's something else that I find that makes sense to do this with, I will. But in the meantime, if this is your first video here, check out what else we have. We have about 100 podcast episodes and a dozen video essays and counting on various topics. Thank you for watching, and hopefully we'll see you next time.